There is a common set of worries or concerns that I get to see by virtue of my engagement with many people through social media, YouTube videos, talks, all sorts of things like that. And it has to do with philosophy and criticism or critique. And here's the way it tends to run. People will say, I'm considering studying so-and-so or this work or this movement, but I've seen that people criticize or critique them. Critique is used very loosely and sometimes in a sloppy way, but it's a very popular term out there. And so because of that, my worry is, should I actually read them? Is it worth doing? Am I going to be going down the wrong track because of that? And this gets expressed by people very understandably who are beginners in philosophy, whether in an academic sense or engaging in self-directed learning, just studying on their own. But it also affects people who are at we could say, more intermediate level, who have more experience, in part because it's so prevalent. And so I wanted to do a video specifically about this issue of criticism and critique and how you can approach it in a more thoughtful and productive way. So the worries or concerns are usually along these sorts of lines, and we could construct the thing. So philosopher or movement X has been or could be potentially criticized or critiqued by, and then pick Y being usually another philosopher or even a movement. So what does that do to the status of that philosopher? That's the thing that's been kind of thrown into limbo, you could say. And so, sometimes it's that, they're not going to be very good. I would be wasting my time. They've been surpassed. I'd be spending my time on stuff that has already been noticed as lacking. There's worries that you yourself could be criticized for wasting your time or energy or mind on this, or even morally bad because you're adopting a perspective that other people don't like, right? So there's kind of a wide net that we can cast here. And the first thing that we should ask ourselves is, why is this, in the first place, a problem or issue that is worth worrying about? Why should people's, on the one hand, emotions get really heavily invested in this? And why, on the other hand, a cognitive side, so we've got the affective, emotional side, and then a cognitive side, why should this be something like a stopping point or lead you automatically to conclusions? And, both of these aspects are really important to look at. Why should this hold you back from studying Descartes or Immanuel Kant or Plato or Mary Wollstonecraft or whoever else it's going to be? And so I think with a lot of people, what is the central emotion here? It's fear, right? And fear isn't always by itself a bad thing. You can be afraid in a rational way. Virtue ethicists spend a lot of time talking about this. Fears can, in fact, be proportional to the thing that is feared, or they can make sense. But a lot of times our fears don't actually make sense, and so we want to know where this is coming from. People might also be worried about, as I pointed out, be getting criticized themselves. Hey, dummy, what are you doing reading that thing over there? That's not worth spending time on. Everybody knows that, blah, 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 right? Or, you could be legitimately worried, okay, I've only got so much time available to me. If I invest it in reading Cicero, is it actually going to be worthwhile? Or should I be reading Seneca instead? Or should I be reading Martin Heidegger? Or should I be reading Marx? Or, pick whoever you want out of the air. And, you could also, I think a lot of people do worry about, okay, if I spend the time to read this philosopher, well, they're automatically going to have some sort of impact on my own thinking. And I don't want to screw myself up by reading the wrong things and becoming a Platonist by reading Plato if Plato is actually wrong about stuff, right? So these are, to some degree legitimate worries, to some degree not legitimate worries. You don't have to automatically buy into any philosopher who you're reading. And if you find yourself doing that, like, I'm reading Plato today, so I become a Platonist. I'm reading the Stoics today, so I become a Stoic. That's a problem you need to look at rather than worrying about this problem. That's a other sort of priority for you. You got to ask, well, why am I so susceptible to, buying into somebody's thing? Am I like looking for a faith to believe in? Am I super concerned about guidance from above or something like that? So, these are all concerns that might figure in. I'll mention one other one. Human beings don't like being ridiculed, laughed at, made fun of. You might say, well, the cool kids are studying this. I don't want to not be one of the cool kids because then they're going to make fun of me. And I'll just say this. If you're going to do philosophy in any sort of serious way, that's something you got to put aside because the cool kids generally aren't into philosophy. When they are into philosophy, they generally get it wrong because they're spending too much time on being cool and not enough on the philosophy. And don't worry about them. I mean, you can read a lot of philosophy where they basically are going to tell you that sort of advice. So let's move on and think about what are the sort of common modes or manifestations of critique, as we're going to call it. And again, we're using that word in a very, very broad sense. So some of them are kind of trivial, and I don't think you actually need to worry about those over much. So for example, mean-spirited personal attacks. Sometimes people will say, I'm not going to spend the time to read, Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel because this guy, Arthur Schopenhauer, who's also an important philosopher, he's got terrible things to say about Hegel. He says that Hegel is a charlatan, So therefore, I don't actually think it's worth reading Hegel. Well, Schopenhauer is, an interesting philosopher, and a lot of times he has really great stuff to say, but whenever he comes to Hegel, he just turns into a raging jerk. And when you read the stuff that he says and you look at Hegel, you can say, wow, where did this come from? It's definitely not coming from Hegel's works. It's coming from something wrong with this guy over here. And you can say that about all sorts of other philosophers. Sometimes philosophers just are kind of closed-minded jerks, or they're motivated by nasty motives that they perhaps don't even understand themselves. And so you don't have to, I think, worry too much about that. Another kind of common critique that people do make is an appeal to, let's call it faddishness. They'll say, nobody does that stuff anymore, reads that stuff anymore. And I've heard that plenty of times in the course of my life. And, it usually ends up being kind of parochial. What they mean is nobody in the circles that I care about and am aware of spends time on this. And they may be even wrong about that, right? I mean, do they follow all their colleagues around and observe their library checkouts and look at their reading list, or are they just going by, what they've seen or heard? A lot of times when people say things like, oh, nobody reads Kierkegaard anymore, or let's take Schopenhauer, right? Schopenhauer's come really back into vogue. When he was publishing stuff for a long time, nobody paid any attention to Schopenhauer. Then he became a big deal. And then he kind of, fell out of favor. I actually remember one of my professors using him as an example of somebody not to write your dissertation on. I was considering writing a dissertation on Derrida, and the professor said, why don't you write on somebody more important, somebody we'll still be reading 100 years from now, not somebody who's just, a footnote to some more important philosopher as Schopenhauer is to Nietzsche, right? And, that professor was wrong about that, right? Schopenhauer is worth reading for his own sake, and maybe even writing a dissertation on. So the faddishness thing, I don't think you need to be worried about that. You could just read through the history of ideas, and you're going to find that things come in and out of vogue. Aristotle in the 18th century, who the hell was reading him other than scholastics? And then in the 19th century, him and Plato they're the real deal for philosophy. Whereas if you were looking at the 18th century, who does somebody like David Hume cite from the most? Cicero. What's Cicero like in the 19th and 20th century? Takes a big nosedive, right? So you don't want to worry about that sort of faddishness. The so-and-so has been surpassed, left behind by, smarter people. I think that's kind of a BS critique or criticism as well, because you can ask, well, which smart people, and how do we know that they're actually smart? It's similar to the nobody's reading or doing this anymore, but it's got a little bit more bite to it because it's saying, the people who actually understand this stuff, they don't think that this person is worth checking out, so we're going to rely on them. And then you've got another, let's say, wrong-headed approach, and people do this all the time. I actually encountered somebody in a talk I gave recently who was blaming René Descartes for all sorts of things because, Descartes separated the mind from the body and never thought about putting them back together. I mean, there's a whole correspondence with Princess Elizabeth about how these things come back together. And, there's an attempt to do so in the Passions of the Soul, as well as other works as well. But it's very common because people don't actually read Descartes to say, well, he's responsible for our mistaken, attitudes towards animals. He's responsible for factory farming. Well, no, that's nonsense. Similarly, Aristotle talks about natural slavery in Politics, Book 1. If you actually read it attentively, what you find out is there are very few natural slaves. Almost all of them are slaves by force, and that's unjust because natural masters are largely missing, right? And slaves taken in war are oftentimes better than their masters. True, Aristotle was used by people who took his passages out of context, added all their own stuff in there to justify antebellum slavery here in the United States and to justify enslavement of Native Americans in South America. But that isn't Aristotle's fault. And Aristotle says a lot of stupid things about women, too. But is that a reason to, dismiss Aristotle altogether? That's what people do quite often with philosophical figures. And I think that's kind of a, it's not really critique. It is a criticism, but it's off-target criticism. Now, when we get to the more serious stuff, we could say that there's, a couple forms that maybe you want to take more seriously. So, in so-and-so's work, they criticize this other philosopher or a philosophical school or movement, and they do so along these explicit lines. Now you got something that's got a bit more teeth, more bite, more substance to it. And so you could say, well, should I study Stoicism? Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil that the Stoics get nature wrong, that they try to stoicize it, they don't understand what they're doing. Hegel says in, the Phenomenology of Spirit in the section on Stoicism that it's essentially a way in which the slave in the master-slave dialectic tries to get beyond it, withdraws within, and it's largely ineffectual. And you can say, okay, well, these are some interesting criticisms. Are they accurate? Are they fully taking into account what that philosophy has to say? Are there assumptions this person is making? Can we infer from so-and-so criticized X, therefore X must be wrong or not valuable or a waste of time? Can we make that inference or not? And we can also talk about people who analyze hidden assumptions or what must be the foundation or basis of this or that, conditions of the possibilities. So this is often critique. This is critique in the formal sense of the term. And those, could be worthwhile or they could be wrong. They could be off base. You can't just assume that because something has been criticized or critiqued, that therefore the critique itself is valuable, is on point, is well-informed, is trying to get to the bottom of things and not motivated by, other factors. And there are, I think, some approaches in philosophy that kind of foster this. So it's understandable that we would have a culture in which people are worried about this. I'll just mention a few. So, the idea of finding a presuppositionless philosophy, so nobody can criticize your presuppositions, or finding some unassailable foundation on which you can build everything up. Okay, that's a motif in philosophy that, quite a few people fell into. And if that's your idea of what it is to do philosophy right, well, you're probably going to be really worried about whether anybody can possibly critique the position that you are buying into. There's also a sort of counter tendency, and I'm going to call it here scholastic, understanding, of course, that what I mean is sort of the pejorative sense of scholasticism and not the great scholastics of the past, where you have everything and it fits into neat little boxes. We could also call this the manualist approach, because scholasticism in the 19th and 20th century, they loved to produce manuals in which, of course, Thomas Aquinas had everything right, and then there were the errors of everybody else, and Descartes fits into this box, and Immanuel Kant fits into this box. And you read through these things and you're like, I don't think that this person actually read Kant. They probably just took some criticisms they got from somebody else who was their teacher or the last book that they read and then superimposed it. People do this today all the time with things like postmodernism. They're like, ooh, the postmoderns, they're all nihilists and relativists. And you're like, well, that's not actually what people who talk about the postmodern in a thoughtful way think about these things. Where are you getting this from? Oh, well, I read this book about postmodernism, and then you look at the book and you're like, ooh, that's crap. I wouldn't rely on that stuff. Well, there's a lot of people who do this from whatever point of view you want. It could be, sort of a bad Thomism. It could be, the classic mentality and everything else is garbage after that. It could be, being a classic liberal or something like that. So anyway, that's an approach that tends to foster this. I'd also say that analytic and continental philosophy both have their own responsibility for this. In analytic philosophy for a long time, the model was you'd put forth something and then everybody would try to criticize and critique it. And they even, coined terms like defeaters, to describe this. And it's not that that's bad, but it does tend to foster the idea that what philosophy really is putting forth some ideas and then everybody else tries to knock them down. And if they can, well, start again. And that's one way to do philosophy, but it sure as hell isn't the only way or the only good way to do it. Continental philosophy, way, way too much focus on genealogies of, Hegel has been clearly surpassed by Marx, or pick Stirner, or pick whoever you want, or Nietzsche criticized him, or, Deleuze has shown us that Hegel, there's nothing to it, right? And what makes you think that these people later on actually got things right? Or they engage in genealogical critique of stuff, and they're like, this idea came from this background, and it's not what it pretends to be. And you can be like, yeah, so what? So what if that's the case? I mean, does that invalidate the idea? Does that mean it's got no applicability? And so, now good analytics, good continentals don't engage in that sort of thing all the time. But, the way that it often gets taught, and those are the two biggest camps, you could say, at least here in America and other parts of the Anglosphere, that tends to foster a mistaken conception of the value of criticism or critique. We could also say that there's a wider culture of insecurity, perhaps fostered by what the internet provides us with, where, it's very easy to criticize other people, and if you're not all that secure in what you're doing in philosophy, or you really need certainty, then, you could be a bit worried about whether critique invalidates what it is that you're trying to do. Now, there's some things that I think could be very, very helpful to keep in mind. And the first one is, with any criticism, you get to ask, and you probably should ask, is this criticism actually valuable? Is it well-informed? Is it on point? Is it directed at the stuff that actually matters? If it were true, how devastating would it be? Does the fact that, Mary Wollstonecraft in her first wave feminist work tends to, talk in favor of the bourgeoisie and downplays the importance of sexual desire and enjoyment within a lasting relationship, taking marriage as the paradigm in favor of friendship, does that invalidate her work? I mean, from the perspective of some later feminists, yes, right? But you can ask, well, if this criticism is true, what actually follows from it? How much does it require us to put away? And when it comes to philosophers, you don't have to buy into a philosopher or a philosophical school or movement or approach 100%. You can say, I like this stuff, I don't like this stuff. That's perfectly fine. We've been doing this throughout the entire history of philosophy. Aristotle doesn't reject everything that Plato says, but he sure thinks the doctrine of forms doesn't make a lot of sense, and he gives you a critique of it, actually multiple critiques of it. And you can decide whether you think Aristotle's got it right or whether Plato maybe has it more right. That's up to you. There's nothing that says that just because somebody made a critique, that critique is actually correct. Sometimes there's just incompatible systems or assumptions that are going on. And a great example of this is one that I brought up earlier. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche does criticize the Stoics at great length in one of the early chapters. Does that mean that Nietzsche's critique demonstrates we shouldn't read the Stoics? Nietzsche has a very different idea of nature than what the Stoics did. They're not even really speaking the same language, though they're using the same word. You shouldn't assume that just because somebody is criticizing somebody else, that they share all of these things in common with each other. Now, I'm not saying Nietzsche didn't understand the Stoics. He talks a lot about the Stoics later on in Beyond Good and Evil, and actually in positive ways, if you read through the text, and you don't just go to the immediate thing that gets spread around like a meme on the internet. So that's worth keeping in mind. Then we can also say, and this is massively important, the object of critique, the philosopher, the movement, do they have a response? Could they, on the basis of what we've got in their texts, could they have a response to what it is that they're being criticized for? Oftentimes this turns out to be the case. So, you want to criticize Aristotle about women or about non-Greeks for that matter, we'd all be barbarians basically, from Aristotle's point of view. Take other parts of Aristotle that bear on that and say, well, he wasn't being completely consistent, but here's what he could say. Or, even better, quite often, if you read through a philosopher's works, you can recognize that the criticism made of them actually is already answered in their works. If you think that, Descartes left us just in doubt and we can't know anything other than I think, therefore I am, well, then you didn't even bother to read the rest of Meditation 2, did you? Because it's not just, well, I'm just a thinking thing, because he labels what are the different modes of thought there. A thinking thing is a thing that, doubts, that affirms, that denies, that wills against, that feels emotions, that perceives, right? You can't be like, well, Descartes cut us off entirely from the external world. No, he didn't. Read all the way through to Meditation 6, where you get it all back, right? I mean, this is just sort of being sloppy when people make criticisms and it's clear that they didn't read the work. Sometimes you'll even find the philosopher having anticipated the very criticisms that are going to be made of them within their works and responding to it. Prime example of this, John Stuart Mill's work, Utilitarianism. If you're going to say, well, the utilitarians, they didn't account for this and they didn't account for this, and then you find that John Stuart Mill, more than 150 years ago, actually considered that and said, here's how I'd respond to that. Again, that's somebody not doing their work. I'm not saying you in that sense. I'm talking about the philosopher in the past or the present who is criticizing them. So, if the thinker can actually provide some sort of reasonable response, maybe the criticism was a bad criticism to begin with. So I'll close by just pointing out two different things. One has to do with, and it does have to do with you. You get to decide whether a criticism really is valuable, and what the implications of it ought to be. It's not as if just because somebody criticized and somebody was criticized that leads us to, well, this guy must be right, this guy must be wrong. It's up to you to decide that and to determine that. And you might be helped out by looking at what other people have to say about that. The other thing is, whenever you think about critique or criticism, it might be helpful for you to think about the original Greek term from which we derive these, krites, which means a judge, somebody who, for example, judges an artistic performance and, gives a thumb up or thumbs down, or a more extensive set of judgments with reasoning for why they judge things to be the way they are. And when we think about it in terms of judgment, our judgments can be right, they can be wrong, sometimes they can be underdeveloped, sometimes we can fail to take things into account. So it makes us more attentive to the, not just responsibility, but the fallibility of criticism and critique, because it is a human activity. There is no such thing as a criticism that hangs out there in the air all by itself. Every criticism was produced by a critic. So it's worth keeping that in mind. They don't always reduce just to the critic, but these are human activities. You are a human being. You get to decide what actually matters when it has to do with somebody having, being a critic and criticizing somebody else. That's something that you have to assume the responsibility for, because you actually do have a choice in whether you accept that criticism and the implications that you draw from it about the value of that. So hopefully, if you are the kind of person who has been holding back from reading the Stoics because you heard that Hegel and Nietzsche criticized them, maybe now you decide, I'll check them out and I'll see whether these people criticizing were actually on point. Or if you were a fan of Mary Wollstonecraft and that's kept you from reading Rousseau, who she does criticize quite a bit, I think quite rightly in many cases, then maybe you need to read them both, right? Or if you're complaining about, well, I can't read Thomas Hobbes because obviously Rousseau criticized him. How do you know that Rousseau got it right? So this is all worth keeping in mind, and hopefully this functions as a kind of pep talk and, what else could we say? A sort of meta-critique of this worry, this concern, this sometimes paralysis that people can fall into.